joining us tonight. I'm Susanna Earle, co-director of the Dale Center. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the third lecture in this year's Richard McCarthy lecture series. This is the 14th year we've been doing this. If you've been missing any of these over the years, they're all on our YouTube channel, so please feel free to look that up. I also want to make sure before we get too much into some intros that I remind you that our fourth lecture in this series is called Spy Games. The fourth lecture will be on February 26th by Dr. Larry Berman. He's from Georgia State University, and his talk is going to be titled The Perfect Spy. He's looking at the life of a double agent who was a Time magazine reporter and Vietnamese communist agent. So if you're really getting into this whole Spy Games lecture series, it's just universally amazing. It'll be 6 p.m. in this room, February 26th. I don't know that Mac and Craig are here, but if you see Richard McCarthy and Craig Howard, JP, thank them for us. When you see them, they really make this lecture series possible year after year. They've invested in us for a long time, and we just couldn't be more grateful for what they make possible for us to do. To the left, make sure if you want to pick up some flyers about our current projects, upcoming ventures. There's also a sign-up sheet if you want to get on our email mailing list. You want to receive our newsletter. And students, if you're here for a class, there's a separate list so that if you don't want to receive our emails, you won't have to. But if you do, if you want to, sign up for that too. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. If you're tweeting about tonight's lecture by Dr. Abra, it's #McCarthyLecture. And I did. Make sure you turn off your cell phones. I always have this perpetual fear that I will be the one that forgets to do this. All right, cell phones are off. Allow me to introduce our speaker tonight, who I'm lucky enough to have as a colleague and a friend. Dr. Allison Abra is Associate Professor of History and a Fellow in the Dale Center for the Study of War and Society right here at Southern Miss. She holds a PhD. Look at you already getting applause. She holds a PhD from the University of Michigan, and her research is generally concerned with questions of culture, gender, and identity during the era of the two world wars, particularly in Britain and Europe. She is the author of Dancing in the English Style, Consumption, Americanization, and National Identity in Britain, 1918 to 1950, published by Manchester University Press last year. And her talk today is based on the research for her new book, which I'm particularly fascinated with, tentatively titled Love and War, An Emotional History of British Espionage During World War II. Welcome, Dr. Abra.
Thank you. Okay, yeah. There's a lot of chords back here. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. I know there's a lot of competition on campus tonight, so I appreciate your attention to this event, and I especially want to shout out my students, some of whom are here and have already listened to me talk for 4.5 hours today in 3 different classes. So it's extra great of you to turn out to hear me talk some more. Where's my little clicker? Okay. So I want to start with an image of a monument that some of you may have seen before. This is on the south bank of the River Thames in London, just across the water from the Palace of Westminster, the British Parliament building, and it is a small monument to the Special Operations Executive, or SOE. During World War II, the SOE was the branch of British intelligence that was charged with espionage and subversive warfare in territories that were occupied by the Axis powers. Hundreds of agents were sent into European countries controlled by the Germans, and the SOE also had a presence in Asia as part of the war effort against the Japanese, particularly in the China-Burma-India theater. Agents conducted sabotage, they orchestrated assassinations of high-ranking enemy leaders, they arranged escape routes for Allied military personnel, and they organized local resistance groups and militaries in order to better coordinate with Allied objectives. Now, among these among these hundreds of SOE agents were 40 women. One of whom, Violette Szabo, we're a little dark, or it's a little light in the slide there, but Violette Szabo, her head is the bust on top of this monument in London. So in the grand scope of SOE operations, the women agents were a relatively small contingent. But I think that the decision to place Violette on top of the bust the monument commemorating the whole organization speaks to their big impact. Particularly after the war, the women agents very quickly became the stuff of legend, and the subject of countless popular and academic histories, memoirs, newspaper stories, novels, public monuments, as we've already seen, documentaries, theatrical productions, television shows, feature films, and even video games. Velvet Assassin down there on the right, I'm not a video game person, but I am told Violette is a part. And actually, this is a good opportunity to shout out the fact that if you're interested in some of these cultural representations of the SOE agents, tomorrow night, the French Club, led by Madame Roland, is going to be showing a movie on campus called Female Agents, about a couple of the women that I'm going to be speaking briefly about tonight. How the British really grappled with the challenge that their unconventional wartime service, which included combat, imprisonment, and in some cases torture and death, posed to the gender norms of the day. So my plan is to talk a little bit and give you some background on the origins and the history of the Special Operations Executive, and then we'll look at a few case studies of particular women agents who I think provide a good breadth of information about the different activities that they were up to, but also speak about their post-war experiences. And then I'm going to close with some reflections on where I think these women fit into the big questions about women and gender during World War II, which, even on our banner over here, you can see are always sort of at the fore of the history of the Second World War. So the SOE was founded in the summer of 1940, just after France had fallen and Britain, along with its empire and Commonwealth, remained one of the last Western European countries left unconquered by the German Blitzkrieg and still formally at war with Nazi Germany. Subversion and espionage was seen to be, one way to keep the British war effort going on some level, at least, after the disasters of the evacuation of Dunkirk and the Franco-German armistice. Now, SOE was originally formed under the auspices of the Ministry of Economic Warfare as an amalgamation of a few different existing groups that the British quickly realized were operating at, cross purposes or in some cases duplicating work. But they continued to have, links to other intelligence branches as well as the armed services. In fact, most of the agents, although not always the women, tended to be enlisted in some other branch of the British military and then were kind of seconded to SOE for their activities. A War Cabinet memorandum from July 19th, 1940 proclaimed that a new organization shall be established to coordinate all action by way of subversion and sabotage against the enemy overseas. This organization will be known as the Special Operations Executive. Or, as Winston Churchill, one of the war's great orators, more pithily put it, their mandate was to set Europe ablaze. Now, as many of you may know already, World War II is really the moment that espionage and subversive warfare modernized and expanded and created the forerunners to some of the organizations that we still know today, like the CIA. And in developing SOE, the thing that the British were really looking to in terms of kind of historical precedents were guerrilla warfare tactics that they might have witnessed in other moments of British warfare or just their own kind of personal service. So for instance, for Churchill, he had covered the Boer War in South Africa as war correspondent, right? And had always been sort of fascinated by the tactics that the Boers had used in the war against the British at the turn of the century. He was also a big fan of Lawrence of Arabia and thought that that was a potentially good model here as well. Whereas another kind of SOE leader, Major General, such a British hard to say name, so many different titles, Major General Sir Colin Govins, based many of his kind of impressions of SOE operations or what they should be on involvement he'd had dealing with the Irish Republican Army. Now, for obvious reasons, SOE operated in tremendous secrecy, both in the field and at home. Very few people knew that it existed or that agents were being sent abroad while the war was going on. It had a lot of nicknames. The SOE was sometimes referred to as the Baker Street Irregulars, kind of a Sherlock Holmes homage, but also a reference to the fact that SOE headquarters were at Baker Street. And again, for the students in the room, those of you who have been or are thinking about going on the British Studies program, you should know that where we live in London, in the British Studies program, our big study abroad program, is like here's SOE headquarters, and here's us. Basically right around the corner. So if you want to go, walk in the footsteps of the SOE, you should come to London with me this summer. That is my plug for BSP. The SOE was often sometimes referred to as Churchill's secret army, or the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. And at its peak, it employed almost 13,000 people, about a quarter of whom were women, working mostly as clerical staff, radio operators, and, as I've already indicated, in a small number of cases, field agents. SOE was active across Europe and Asia, divided into designated sections, usually named according to the first letter of the country's name, right? So F section for France and the like. But what were they specifically doing? Well, reconnaissance and information gathering was a critical part of their work. The agents in Europe reported back about enemy troop movements, about possible bombing targets for the Allies, and they also helped to facilitate the rescue of Allied service personnel, particularly downed aircrew that may have found themselves in occupied territory. They also engaged in acts of sabotage, derailing trains, destroying factories, and other sites of economic or military importance to the enemy war effort. One of their more famous operations in this respect was to send agents into Norway to destroy a heavy water plant that was key to German efforts to develop an atomic bomb in 1943. They also assassinated some high-level German targets. And the SOE was responsible in particular for the ambush that ultimately killed Reinhard Heydrich in Prague in 1942. And if you're not familiar with Heydrich, he was very high-ranking SS officer, basically number 2 to Heinrich Himmler, really one of the architects of the final solution. It was in fact Heydrich that chaired the meeting at Wannsee outside of Berlin in 1942 before he was killed that sort of developed the plan for the so-called final solution to the Jewish question. Another part of SOE's remit, though, perhaps the most important one, was to supply, coordinate, and organize local resistance groups in the occupied territories. This became especially important as the Allies began to gear up for the invasion of Northwest Europe that would ultimately begin with D-Day in June 1944, and they needed these local groups to support the landings in various ways. So along with their SOE agents, or SOE partners, the French resistance held and destroyed bridges, roads, and so forth in order to impede German defenses and support the Allied advance. Now, women SOE agents operated almost exclusively in France, which, as I mentioned before, was known as F section in the SOE, and it was headed up by the man you see on the left here, Maurice Buckmaster. And another really significant figure in sort of F section was Vera Atkins, who you see on the right there, who was really responsible for kind of recruiting agents, sort of overseeing their training from Baker Street, kind of getting reports about how they were doing and so forth, and ultimately their welfare. And Vera Atkins is a really fascinating figure in her own right, about which a fair amount has been written. One of the things that she undertook after the war that makes, that was a really kind of dramatic story is that she went to Europe sort of immediately, or to the continent immediately after, basically as the war was still wrapping up, to try to find out what had happened to her missing agents, of which there were quite a number, basically sort of visiting concentration camps, interrogating German prisoners and so forth, trying to find out what had happened to the agents that had just gone missing and no one sort of knew where they were. The situation in F section was one of the more complicated that the SOE was dealing with. As some of you may know already, from 1940 to 1944, after it fell and sort of following D-Day and the Allied advance across France, the country was divided, at least for some of that time, into different zones. There was the occupied zone where the Germans were, but then there was also the so-called free zone, or with its capital at Vichy, where a French collaborationist government was working alongside the Germans and sort of nominally independent, but not really so much. There was also a chunk that was being occupied by the Italians. There was chunks of it that were given back to Germany, particularly in eastern France, the territories of Alsace and Lorraine. So this was a complicated set of conditions that the SOE kind of had to consistently navigate. The French resistance evolved and sort of morphed and transformed alongside all of the changes. Eventually the free zone was actually occupied by the Germans as well. The entry of the Soviet Union into the war did a lot to kind of spur on the French resistance, because French communists now felt like they could really, get going. The other thing that lent a lot of complexity, though, to F-section operations, sort of that was different than some of the other SOE areas, was that the Free French, led by Charles de Gaulle, were also sending agents into France and trying to do their own intelligence operations, and it meant that SOE, they weren't allowed to recruit from within the French military, so like finding agents was complicated, and I'll say more about that in a minute. F-section, though, as you can see from the map on the right, was itself divided up into different networks, which were codenamed with the name of an occupation, right? Like scientist, jockey, all that kind of stuff. And in each network, SOE personnel generally included a leader or organizer who was responsible for the circuit and basically charged with organizing local resistance in that area. There would also be in each network a wireless operator who sent and received coded messages from London via a suitcase-sized radio set, and you can see an example of one there. Then there would be a courier who passed messages between circuit members, so, trying to keep the radio operator and the leader from having to meet. Sometimes the courier would be the link between the two. Couriers also did things like transport weapons, and other supplies, located drop zones for agents and the various things that the Allies were sending in. And then depending on what was going on in a particular section, there might be other British personnel on the ground, demolitions or weapons experts, people that were there to train the resistance, that kind of thing. Now, women agents served in all of these capacities. As we'll see, there were female wireless operators, female circuit leaders, but mostly they were couriers, in part because the SOE understood the same thing that resistance movements across Europe realized pretty quickly, which was that women are really good spies or really good at espionage because they're less suspicious. It was the 1940s. The assumption was that if you were a woman walking down the street with a baby carriage, there probably weren't guns in it. But sometimes that's what was happening. Women have more natural camouflage, purses, all these various things that enabled them to be less suspicious. Particularly because if you were a man of sort of military service age in France during the war, you were instantly suspicious. Because first of all, why were you not a POW, since there were many who were? After 1943, men of a certain age were required to register for forced labor in Germany. So if it's 1943 and you're like a 25-year-old guy walking down the street, the Germans are instantly paying attention to you. The Vichy officials are instantly paying attention to you. That was not true of women. And then, of course, there were a lot of cases of women being able to kind of flirt their way out of a mess, use their sexuality in various ways as well. So SOE agents, whether they were men or women, came from a range of backgrounds, and they were recruited in a lot of different ways. The secrecy of the organization meant that the process was complicated and sort of ad hoc, and to some extent reliant on word of mouth and previously established personal relationships. So military colleagues, friends, and even family members often recommended one another. And one of the things I'm actually really interested in sort of further pursuing in my book research is this way in which the SOE really was a family affair. Siblings, married couples, and lovers frequently served together in the SOE, sometimes even in the field. So for instance, in F section, Agent Claude de Bissac helped to recruit his sister Lise, you can see in the middle, for service. She's in the movie that Madame Roland is showing tomorrow night. He also then entered in the field into a sexual relationship with his courier, Mary Catherine Herbert, who became pregnant and had the baby in the field and then disappeared. I'm still trying to figure this out. It's a pretty wild story. And they did ultimately get married, although seemingly just to give the baby a name. They didn't actually live together after the war. Other agents were targeted from within the armed forces if they were identified as having some of the requisite skills, like a good touch on the wireless, as it was known, or more to the point, if they spoke the language, right? That was a really key thing. Could you pass for French or Dutch or whatever the case may be? And so for this reason, a lot of SOE agents were not actually British, or at least entirely British, in that you had a lot of exiled civilians and soldiers from the occupied territories who were basically sent back. So for instance, the heavy water operation in Norway was conducted by Norwegian agents. The assassination of Heydrich was Czech agents. In the case of France, there was a fair number of French Canadians. And then also a lot of British-born children of some of the kind of Franco or Anglo-French, I guess, marriages from the First World War, right? So like British soldiers who've gone to France to fight World War I, met a French girl, got married, 20 years later they have a kid who's military service age, who speaks the language because they had a French mother, or may have spent some time there, and so forth. And as we're going to see in the case of some of the women agents, they often came to SOE's attention in sort of weird ways or unique ways. But like I said, it was fairly ad hoc. And potentially and probably not unsurprisingly, initially recruiting women for this work was controversial. It presented a considerable challenge to the gender norms of the time to send women behind the lines. In fact, within the military, it was illegal. They weren't allowed to do this. So about midway through the war, though, SOE realized that they had to find ways to get around the law and get around the cultural mores of the time because women frequently had the language skills that they needed. And as we've already talked about, women had other attributes that made them good agents. So they found sneaky ways to do it, in particular by sort of, taking women, even if they were already enlisted in a branch of the military, and sort of rerouting them into something called the First Aid Nurses Yeomanry, the Fannies, because they were still by and large a civilian organization, and that made it somehow not illegal. So they had to do all of these sneaky maneuvers, but they started sending them. So once they were identified, potential agents went through a training regimen that was determined which was designed to determine their suitability for espionage and provide them with the practical skills that they would need: spycraft, silent killing, parachute training, and the like. Men and women received the same training, and they trained alongside each other in a lot of commandeered or requisitioned country houses around the British Isles. And some of these images, they're sort of contemporaneous. They're from something kind of weird, which is that after the war, when the story of the SOE first came out, they made this movie, this hour-long movie about sort of the experience of the SOE that starred SOE agents as themselves. So it's not the best in terms of acting, but it's on YouTube, you can watch it, and it's called School for Danger. And some of these images are from that. No, it's just a random house, yes. So after they completed their training, most agents were dropped into France by parachute, although others were landed by airplane and some approached by sea, sometimes approaching by a submarine and then being offloaded if weather conditions didn't cooperate for parachute trainings. They were often, as you can see in this painting, met by other agents or the French resistance who would mark the drop point with flashlights or fires. Sometimes they dropped blind though, they just kind of jumped into the plane and hope for the best, which was of course exceedingly dangerous. And then the networks were in regular communication with London via their wireless operator through scheduled transmissions. But they also got information from London through the BBC. You could pick up the BBC in France, and so the SOE used the BBC to broadcast messages to their networks in code. So, like, Anthony is taking a trip to the seashore, and that kind of thing. They would sort of gather around and listen. Missions lasted anywhere from a few days to well over a year in some cases, and, this was very risky work. In total, there were slightly under 500 SOE agents who were sent into France throughout the occupation, and about 25% of them died in the field. Some from natural causes, some in combat, but mostly through arrest, deportation to German concentration camps, and ultimately execution. It was one of the reasons the SOE went through a period of pretty strong controversy much later, sort of in the 60s and 70s, about was it actually effective? And I could say a little bit more about that. The dead included 13 women. So the SOE continued operations only for the duration of the war. It was shuttered in 1946, though some of its staff and operations were absorbed into other parts of the British intelligence apparatus. So that's kind of the backstory. Now I want to tell you a little bit about some of the women themselves. And I'm going to start with the one who you already met by way of her, bust, her statue bust, I should say. Violette Szabo, probably the most famous SOE, female SOE agent. She was born in Paris in 1921. One of 5 children of Charles Bouchel and his French wife, Gwen. They moved to London, where Charles worked a number of kind of, in the British sense, like upper working class, lower middle class jobs. He was a car salesman, a taxi driver, that kind of thing. Violette was remembered by people after the war for her Cockney accent. So while there's sort of this sense of the SOE was very elite and, the old school tie, and that's how they all found each other, things like that, there was a lot of kind of some class diversity just based, again, on like language skills. During the Depression, Violette and her younger brother got sent back to France to live with family for a while, which is why she was so fluent in French, to kind of help the family save money. And eventually she came back to London, and at 14 she left school and started taking up a number of jobs. She worked at a lingerie store. She worked at Woolworths, and when the war broke out, she was working the perfume counter at a department store. And eventually she would go on to do stints in the aftermath of the war breaking out in the Women's Land Army and in a munitions factory, until fate intervened. In 1940, on the French holiday of Bastille Day, 19-year-old Violette went to some of the celebrations kind of sent by her mother, and met a guy named Etienne Szabo, who was a French Foreign Legion officer, who was one of many French, particularly service people, who were in London following the evacuation of Dunkirk, kind of just hanging out till the Allies figured out their next move. And the story is that Violette's mom, basically being French, said to Violette, go find a Frenchman and bring him home for dinner, we should open our doors to these poor trapped French people. So she did, and they got married. They had a very whirlwind romance. Within just a few weeks, they got married, and then Etienne was posted abroad. They were reunited a year or so later. She became pregnant and had a baby named Tanya, who Etienne unfortunately never met, because he was killed in the Battle of El Alamein in North Africa in October of 1942. And so it was shortly after that Violette came to the attention of the SOE, and it seems to be one of her motivating impulses was to avenge her husband's death, right? She really wanted to serve over that. She made it through training and was sent on her first mission in April of 1944. It was a very brief, kind of few days long thing where she and her partner, Philippe Bouet, were there to try to kind of assess the state of a resistance cell in Le Havre. That it turned out was totally broken. There had been a bunch of arrests, so they gathered a bit more other information and then headed back to London. Importantly, though, or just as a sort of interesting sideline to her story, she went shopping in Paris, like on her way out of town, and she bought a little dress for Tanya, and she bought perfume for her mother. Which became part of her sort of myth and her story, and it's features in the movie about her life that I'll talk about in a minute. So she returned to Britain and then was sent back to France a couple of months later with 2 more agents. In fact, they landed, or they jumped on the plane like the day after the D-Day. They kind of were flying over, the beaches as everything was going down, with orders to organize resistance efforts around the city of Limoges and help further support the Allied landings. Security, not surprisingly, a lot tighter in France after D-Day had begun. Especially in German-held areas. And so within a day of arriving, Violette and her companions came across a German roadblock. They were armed, so they knew they were going to be instantly, suspicious of the Germans or found out by the Germans. So instead, they just tried to flee. They didn't try to kind of ride out the roadblock. The story is that Violette laid down machine gun fire against the Germans as she escaped. In fact, she might have been hurt. She had an ankle injury that had never really healed properly from a parachute drop, and at a certain point told her male comrades to go on without her, and she was captured. She was held initially at a local prison in Limoges, and her fellow agents started to make plans to try to rescue her during the time every day that she was transported from the prison to Gestapo headquarters to be interrogated. But the day before they were going to attempt the rescue, she was moved. She was transferred to Paris and held at Fresnes prison, where she was subjected to brutal interrogations at the infamous Avenue Foch. I was going to ask you if it's Foch, right? Yes, okay. The Avenue Foch headquarters, which was Gestapo headquarters in Paris, actually. And there's some debate about whether Violette was tortured or not. And I can explain in the Q&A if you're interested why that actually matters to sort of the post-war memory of the SOE, but whether she was or not, she apparently gave nothing away. And in fact, after refusing to talk, and with the Allies closing in on Paris in August of '44, the Germans decided to move her again. They sent her to Ravensbrück concentration camp just outside of Berlin, which was a woman's prison or a woman's camp, along with 2 other female SOE agents, Denise Bloch and Lillian Rolf. There's a story that on the train on the way, the train kind of got briefly derailed or sort of, diverted, or something went wrong where she actually had an opportunity to escape, but all 3 of them did. But instead of taking it, what they ended up doing was, because they were women and British and all of these things, they were not imprisoned on the train, really. They were just kind of sitting on seats, whereas the male prisoners and everybody else who was on the train that was being transported were being held much more kind of cow car, brutal conditions, in much more difficult conditions. And so instead of escaping when they could, they instead took water to the rest of the prisoners and then stayed in custody and were not able to escape. When they got to Ravensbrück, they endured brutal living and working conditions throughout the fall until one day, we don't know exactly when, in January or February of 1945, so only a few months before the end of the war, all 3 of the women were summoned from their cells and read a death sentence. And the story that the Germans had was that they held hands as they were forced to kneel, and they were each shot in the head one at a time. So Violette was 23. After the war, she was awarded the George Cross and a number of other honors. Interesting thing about all the female agents initially were given the George Cross, which, well, not all of them, but the ones who were given military accolades. It's not a military accolade, I should say. The ones that were bestowed honors, it's a civilian honor, and we can kind of talk about why that's important in a minute. But this is an image of Tanya wearing all of her mother's medals. And I think, the fact that she had this child, that she was such a well-known beauty, the fact that she died so tragically. Violette was a sensation after the war. Like I said, she is probably the most famous, and we can kind of talk about all these different reasons, but this is just some examples of the mass cultural output of things about Violette. The number of books, the monument, the novels. This is the Violette Szabo Museum in a small town in England. This is the movie they made in the 50s about her. Here's, famous blue plaques, as they like to do in London. Famous person lived here. And so she had a tremendous impact after the war. In fact, the whole way that I originally learned about the SOE was that my mom saw that movie when she was babysitting one night in the 60s on TV. It was forever fascinated by the SOE for that reason. So like Violette, she was a courier. Like I said, most women agents served as in that role, but there were a few that also worked as wireless operators. And the first of these was the next one I want to talk about, Noor Inayat Khan. Noor has a really fascinating background. She was kind of a citizen of the world. Her father was an Indian prince who became an important Islamic spiritual figure, leader of something called the Sufi order, which preached love and pacifism. Her mom was American. She was born in Russia. When her father was performing there as part of a musical group, but she spent most of her childhood in Paris, although briefly she also lived in London, and was therefore fluent in French. She also studied French and a number of other topics like child psychology at the Sorbonne in Paris, and so she was highly educated. She was in fact a published author before the war. She, in particular, had published children's stories and fairy tales, which was one of the reasons apparently she had a bit of a kind of I don't know what the right word would be, but sort of like a fairy tale-like demeanor, right? She kind of was someone who had her head in the clouds and was very creative, and SOE was not sure about her for that reason. But when France fell, or even before, just when the war began, given her family's religious beliefs, she had a very strong sense of outrage about what was happening in Nazi Germany, and of course, once France was invaded, she felt that even more keenly. As France fell, the Khans were able to escape to Britain because one of her brothers had been born in the period when they had been living in London, and so he had British citizenship, and that's kind of how they were able to get out of there. And so she was determined to still do something for the war effort. She joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, where she rose up through the ranks, and was one of these people that got identified because she was really good on the radio. And so by late 1942, her knowledge of languages and her facility with signals work had brought her to the attention of SOE. They decided to train her as an agent, and she would be the first female wireless operator sent to France in June 1943. But she kind of walked immediately into a really bad situation. Her mission was to be the wireless operator for something called the Prosper Circuit, which was the one in and around Paris. But within days of her arrival there, she was betrayed by a double agent, and every member of Prosper except Noor were captured, including another female agent named André Borel. And the circuit's destroyed, decimated, and London said, you should come back. Like, let's get you out of there. And she refused to go. Instead, she went on the run, eluding the Gestapo, as well as the Germans had these radio detection bans, right? Which is why being a wireless operator was such dangerous work, because they literally would drive around sort of detecting your signal, and you could only be on the air for a certain amount of time before they would catch you. So she's, running around Paris, moving every night, trying to be kept from being caught. And for, most of the summer and fall of 1943, she was basically the only connection the Allies had to the resistance, or what was left of it, in Paris. She became really well known to the Germans, notorious Madeleine, that was her code name. And so they set a really high target or bounty on her head, and ultimately she was betrayed by someone who offered to sell information about her whereabouts to the Germans. She was captured shortly thereafter. She kind of made a big mistake in her capture, in that she was caught with her code books. So the Germans were able to then keep basically impersonating her on the radio for a number of weeks after that, which further messed things up for the resistance and the SOE. But meanwhile, Noor, apparently, when she was captured, put up a really strong fight, sort of in contrast to this idea that the SOE had that maybe she wasn't tough enough for this kind of work with her fairy tales and all those kinds of things. In fact, she was also taken to Avenue Foch, just like Violette would be, where she was interrogated and made multiple escape attempts. One of them was like within an hour of arriving, she was like out the window and caught again, but eventually the Germans couldn't get anything out of her, and they decided to transfer her to a prison in Germany. Because of her sort of history of escape attempts, she was reportedly kept chained and manacled in solitary confinement for almost a year on really low rations, until in mid-September 1944, she was transferred along with 3 other agents, Yolande Beekman, Madeleine de Varant, and Eliane Plumin, to Dachau near Munich, and they were executed shortly after arrival. And there was confusion about her fate for a long time after the war. In fact, when Vera Atkins went to the continent to try to kind of find out what had happened to her agents that had gone missing, they thought that Noor had been one of the 4 women executed at another concentration camp, Natzweiler, Struhoff, who were in fact the 4 other women that you can see there. And it was Sonia Olszewski, because they had all these very vague descriptions, right? Like small brunette woman was kind of all they knew. So they were like, well, that must have been Noor. But this was another sort of mass execution of SOE women. There were basically 3 of them, and then a couple of other women who died on their own at Natzweiler Struhoff in what was then the Third Reich, but is now France. And I want to point especially to this one, because I actually went to Natzweiler last March with Kelsu and our students in the Chateau program. And so when I had been there, and then I went to London to start doing this research, I was reading the reports of what had happened to these women, and I could visualize it so clearly because we had just been there. And so they really caught me, the Natzweiler 4 in addition. But now we will stop talking about executions. But this is the reality of what happened to a lot of these women. The next story has a bit of happy. And it's about one of the few women who rose to a position of leadership in the SOE, Pearl Witherington, who was a British woman born to expatriate parents. She was employed at the British Embassy in Paris when the war broke out. She escaped from occupied France with her mother and 3 sisters, eventually making it to London, where she found work in the Air Ministry and was eventually recruited by SOE in 1943. One report has it that she was the best shot in the whole outfit during training. And she was dropped into France by parachute in September of 1943, where she joined the stationer network led by a guy named Maurice Southgate, and was his courier for about 8 months, running around France pretending to be a cosmetic saleswoman, helping them to kind of pave the way for D-Day. But when her circuit leader was captured, Southgate got captured in May of '44, Witherington became the leader of a new network, the Wrestler Network, which covered a 300-mile territory between Toulouse and Orléans. And she reorganized the network along with her fiancé, who she teamed back up with at some point. And it contained about 1,500 members of the Maquis, sort of paramilitary branch of the French resistance. And they would go on to play a really important role in the sort of immediate aftermath of D-Day. In fact, they were so effective that the Germans put an $1 million franc bounty on her head. At one point on June 11th of '44, there was the Germans sent a 2,000-man force to attack her and the men she was with. It led to a 14-hour artillery battle. And in the end, her unit would preside over the surrender of over 18,000 German troops. So there's no question that she was in combat, right? That she had been a military leader, that she had engaged in these activities. But there was still, after the war, a lot of resistance to bestowing her with more than civilian honors. In fact, it wasn't until 2006 that she finally got her wings. The Royal Air Force sort of looked at her service record and realized that the number of parachute drops she had done sufficed according to their kind of combat standards, and she got her wings. So it opens up, I think, the Witherington case and this sort of refusal to give military honors to these women, opens up questions about how they were regarded during and after the war that I want to kind of close with by telling you about my favorite ladies left. And that is Odette Sansom. Also French-born. She was the daughter of a French bank manager who was killed at Verdun in the First World War shortly before the armistice in 1918. When she was kind of in her teens, she met an English businessman named Roy Sansom and married him in 1931, where she moved with him to Britain. And they had 3 kids, 3 daughters, Françoise, Lily, and Marianne. And when the war broke out, Roy joined the army, and Odette and the family moved to the English countryside to be safe from the bombing, where she came to the attention of the SOE in kind of a roundabout way. The Admiralty in 1942, the British Navy, had kind of appealed to the British public through the newspaper and the radio for postcards or family photos or whatever people had of like the French coastline and urban areas that they could use in sort of military planning. And of course, Sansom had grown up near the French coast, so she was like, I got some pictures. Put them in an envelope, sent them accidentally to the War Office instead of the Admiralty, which is how she apparently came to the attention of the SOE. So they tried to recruit her, and she was initially very reluctant. She had 3 young children, but eventually kind of said, well, okay, fine, I'll do the training, but I'm sure I'll wash out. She did not wash out, and in fact, as the training progressed, she told, or she said in an interview that she did after the war with the Imperial War Museum that the further she went in the training, the more she wanted to pass, because of course, when you were in the midst of the training, they were given a lot more information about what was really going on in France than the public was, right? And she was a French citizen and loved her country and felt, she actually says in the interview, she was like, I was a woman with a strong sense of duty. So she felt compelled to serve to protect both of her countries, and ended up being one of the very first women sent to France by sea in November of 1942, where she was the courier to the Spindle Network, led by this guy, Peter Churchill. Note the name, although he's not a relation. And for the next few months, she was their courier. She liaised with the resistance there. She organized weapons drops. Churchill went back to London for a while, and she led the circuit while he was gone. They also seem to have fallen in love and started an affair in France. In fact, they were together when they were captured in April of 1943. And just like Violette would be a year later, they were sent to Fresnes prison in Paris. And crucially, as they were captured, though, they were able to convince the Germans that they were a married couple and that Peter Churchill was the nephew or some relation of Winston Churchill, which he was not. He said in a post-war interview, we might have been like 60th cousins. I mean, there probably was some connection, but Winston Churchill definitely did not know who he was. And during subsequent interrogations, Odette was able to convince the Germans not only of this Churchill relationship, but that she was the spy being, the French-born person, and that Churchill was just kind of her like hapless, ignorant husband, had no idea what she was up to, poor guy. And so for the combination of those factors, the fact that he got this privileged status as the nephew of the prime minister, and the fact that they believed she was the actual major spy, meant that Churchill, he was imprisoned until the end of the war, but she was the one who really suffered extremely brutal treatment. Unlike Violette, we know for sure that Odette was tortured. We have her medical records from after the war and her own testimony. Her toenails were pulled out. They burned her back with a red-hot poker. And yet she revealed nothing. Most importantly, the location of their wireless operator. She was the only person who knew where he was. And so in June of 43, they just gave up on these interrogations and sentenced her to death and sent her to Ravensbrück. She was not put to work there in the way that Violette was. Instead, they kept her in a prison cell on a starvation diet in solitary confinement for over a year. At certain points, she was denied food altogether, such as when the Allies landed in the south of France. The commandant of Ravensbrück wanted to punish Odette for this Allied military success. But they never killed her. Like, they passed a death sentence on her like 3 or 4 times, and it seems to have been because of the success of this lie about her connection to the Churchills, because as the Allies were advancing and the Germans were collapsing, the Ravensbrück camp commandant came and got her and brought her with him when he went to surrender to the Allied troops. And he basically, it was an American contingent, and he said to them, this is the story at least, "This is Frau Churchill. She has been a prisoner." And she said, "This is the commandant of Ravensbrück. You make him a prisoner." So, yeah, she was pretty awesome. So Churchill also survived the war, and having been interned at Sachsenhausen, and they were reunited in London. And ultimately she divorced her husband and married Churchill in 1947. Fortunately, they also later got divorced. But actually, it's sort of interesting why we think that happened as well. I can say more about that if you're interested. But, and she married another SOE agent, a guy named Jeffrey Hallows, who she had not served with, but got to know through like SOE alumni organizations or whatever the case may be. And she was married to him until her death in 1995. But her wartime service left a mark. She suffered ongoing physical and psychological problems as a result of her torture and imprisonment, and would receive disability accommodations from the British government, or compensation from the British government for the rest of her life. She also seems to have taken her role as one of the surviving female agents very seriously. In 1950, a movie was made about her life, and this was kind of the scroll. She collaborated with the movie, or cooperated with the making of the movie. And it opens with this. It is with a sense of deep humility that I allow my personal story to be told. I'm a very ordinary woman to whom a chance was given to see human beings at their best and their worst. I knew kindness as well as cruelty, understanding as well as brutality. My comrades who did far more and suffered far more profoundly are not here to speak. It is to their memory that this film has been made, and I would like it to be a window through which may be seen those very gallant women, that's where I got the title of my talk, with whom I had the honor to serve. So as this tells you, Odette was a really prominent figure in Britain after the war. One historian has claimed that in the 1950s, she was as famous as Princess Diana would be in the 1980s. She, like Violette, she also got a lot of press coverage. There was biography, there was the movie that I mentioned. But I think it's important to see that there was a tension in Sansom's post-war representation between kind of recognition and respect for her important wartime contributions, and an effort to sort of mitigate the challenge that they posed to traditional gender roles. So she was actually the first one to be given the George Cross in 1946, and I mentioned this medal a couple of times, but it was one that was awarded for acts of the greatest heroism or for most conspicuous courage in circumstances of extreme danger, not in the presence of the enemy. It was an award that was created to be able to sort of honor people that had done something really brave during the Blitz, for instance, or the entire island of Malta was given the George Cross for enduring a siege and being bombed. And so there was, like we discussed with Witherington, there was this resistance to bestowing military honors on these women. There was also a lot of attention given and respect granted to the fact that she testified at the Ravensbrück war crime trials and helped to convict the commandant and a number of other people on trial there.
And so she was recognized for what she did, but they also really liked it that she fell in love in the field, right? It was her marriage to Churchill that garnered the most press attention after the war. The fact that it had seemingly begun as an adulterous relationship was kind of glossed over, at least publicly. I could say more about that too. And they made a lot of her relationship with her children, and also, interestingly, with Violette's daughter. She didn't know Violette. They had not served together. But at the opening of a monument that you can see here to the women who served in the SOE, that's her holding Tanya. And she, said something like, I hope Violette would have done the same for me and looked after my daughters, and I feel an obligation to Tanya as well. And so she was very much presented as a wife and a mother and sort of a subject of romantic desire in a way I think was about kind of mitigating the challenge of her service. The fact that, she had been trained in, in combat, she had been in prison, she had been tortured. This was part of a general tendency after the war, wherein, even more so in the US, British women were encouraged and in fact compelled by a draft to participate in various aspects of the war effort, whether it was war work or military service or the like. But there was always kind of a clear discomfort with the challenge this presented to gender roles and ways to sort of try to put the genie back in the bottle. There was always an emphasis on the temporary nature of this work. There were also a lot of attacks on women during the war for, alleged promiscuity and other forms of, non-traditional feminine behavior as they saw it. The image on the right here is sort of, I love it, but it's a famous one that kind of encapsulates this campaign they refer to as beauty as duty. Yes, you've got to do your duty, but you better look good while you're doing it. Put on your lipstick. And so there was this effort to reinforce traditional gender roles, even as women were being asked to do non-traditional things, which became even stronger after the war. And it was particularly viewed to be necessary in the case of the women agents, who, as I said, received weapons and unarmed combat training, had been infiltrated behind enemy lines, and in some cases had, been killed in the course of their service. So I think the emphasis on a few select number of agents, the ones who had children, who had romantic relationships. I'm running out of time, so I won't talk about the other examples that I was going to, but I can say more about that in the Q&A. Well, actually, let me just show you this image because it's too awesome. This is an image of another SO agent, Marguerite Knight, who you can see here, right? The whole article is incredible. It's basically 2 years ago, she was fighting the Nazis. Now she's just fighting her child to put away his toy. And you can see kind of along the bottom here, they have her in this very domestic image, Croix de Guerre, MBE, which is a British accolade. So just to conclude, I think you see in the history of the women of the SOE an important window into wartime, but also post-war gender relations. In the era of Rosie the Riveter, or her British equivalent over there on our banner, expanding roles for women in the military, these women really, in some ways, embodied the apex of female wartime service. But they also strongly illustrate the effort to contain the potential social transformation that service had, the possibility of fomenting. The examples that I've given you are mostly from the 1940s and 1950s. And as we already talked about too, interest in the women spies has persisted very, substantially throughout the post-war period. So as I continue this research, what I'm particularly interested in thinking more about is what the multitude of these cultural representations of the SOE women can tell us about a lot of different things in history. Why was there suddenly a TV show about the SOE in the 80s that focused on women? What can we do with a movie like the one that Madame Roland's going to show tomorrow night, which is, from the 2000s? And so I think that this interest, even though they were small in numbers, their cultural impact that has the potential to tell us a lot of things. Thank you. Questions? I think we have a few minutes, right? Yeah.
I'm thinking about The Americans, because I like to watch that show a lot, and I think that dynamic with the relationship is a big part of why it lasts. What is it about women spies plus the relationship aspect that makes it so much more sort of addictive as a subject, as opposed to just women as spies?
Like, why is there always a romantic element?
Yeah.
So this is what the new book is about. It's called Love and War. So I think there's two bits to it. I think there's the piece I've kind of presented tonight, which is, this was a way of sort of reaffirming them as traditionally feminine. Like, at the end of the day, they're still sexy and they want to get married and have babies, right? But I actually also think it's true history, right? It's like, it's actually part of their experience, and that's what I'm really trying to unpack in the book, that a lot of these women fell in love in the field. I'll just sort of like backtrack. You can see one of the other images I was going to show you about, another romance that began as they jumped into France, right? And actually I recently found out this woman ultimately married a guy that she was in France with, but then had a relationship with a different guy in the field. I told you about the Dubai sex and, how like she got pregnant in the field. There were a lot of romances that resulted from this. Violette maybe even had started to date another agent. He, at the very least, he said in his post-war memoir, wanted her to come to the field with him, but SOE knew he was in love with her and wouldn't let her. So the fact that romance and love was such a big part, both familial love and romantic love, was such a big part of this, I'm really curious to think about the impact of that. Because I just think that, it's a hard thing to get at, but there's just fundamentally a difference. The fact that Odette went to such lengths to protect Peter, would she have done that just for her normal circuit leader, or was it because they were having this affair? There's a growing interest amongst military historians into this idea of kind of like emotions as something that actually affects the conduct of warfare. What if, Harry Pillebet hadn't been allowed to, go into France with Violette? How would that have sort of reshaped things? So I think it both, does some important things in terms of the culture of gender, but it also was actually a part of this story that gets glossed over. Like, yeah, it makes a good movie, but what about the fact that they actually did have these romantic relationships? I don't really know yet, but figure that out.
You mentioned Rose's River, in a general sense, maybe not spies. Is there a thread that's different between English representations of women during war and American representations of women during the war?
I mean, I think the short answer is no. I think that this was kind of, across the combatant nations, a reality wherein women were being asked to serve in kind of non-traditional roles. It depended. The U.S. didn't have to go quite as far because, they just, like, for instance, there's a famous article that kind of makes the case that, women were not put into combat roles in the Women's Army Corps in the U.S. context, and combat roles in this sense were kind of manning anti-aircraft nests and things like that, because they didn't need them. They didn't need the personnel, so it wasn't as necessary to kind of challenge the gender lines or provoke the controversy. Whereas in like the Soviet Union, they had women fighter pilots and women snipers and women in all kinds of different units because military necessity required it, but it didn't necessarily, it still was resisted, right? It didn't kind of like the scholars of the Soviet Union will say, like, it's still, yeah, they did these amazing things, but then they still had that same pushback after the war, this kind of effort to reassert traditional roles. So it seems like it doesn't matter how far they went, except that maybe they just had to try a little bit harder to reassert. But I think it's a very parallel story in most combatant nations of the war that that you had to balance out this military and just home front necessity against the general discomfort that people felt with putting women in sort of these non-traditional roles. Yeah.
In looking at the films and the other things after the war, given that many of these women were in fact French or had some kind of ties to France, is this presented as a great moment in British history? Are these British women by the time they're in the film? Even if they were French women when they were recruited?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that it's not like it's denied. I mean, in the Odette movie, they very much made clear that she was French and so forth. Although they had a British actress playing her. So I think it was kind of recognized, but it certainly is being sold as like a British agency and very kind of a great moment for the British war effort. But the fact that it was such a kind of like nationally diverse body is interesting to me too. And in the case, for instance, of Mary Catherine Herbert, the one who got pregnant in the field, when she disappears at a certain point, they figure out that she's like gone home to her mom. Like her mom is in France, right? And so it kind of creates this other dynamic where, you know, some of them didn't want to come back, like they, you know, only been in Britain because of the occupation in the first place, and so once they were coming back in France, they just sort of stayed. I don't know if that's probably answering your question, but I think it's being sold as like a British success story, but they're not denying the fact that these women weren't all British. It's a good question, though.
And I would like to say that I'm very grateful to these women, French women also who participated in the SOE, because thanks to their involvement, Charles de Gaulle, right after the war, granted all French women the right to vote. And yes, and you know, French women started voting in 1945. Asking myself if this had not happened in French, because he recognized the role of women in the French resistance, and he said that would be the first thing he would sign when France was liberated. And several women that you mentioned, André Morel and all this, you know, it's thanks to this woman's sacrifice, courage in the war that we women, French women, were granted. But then wondering when would that have happened if they had not done it. So thanks to them, my grandmother was able to go.
Nicole?
So that a popular image of the female spy is a woman who sort of weaponizes her sexuality. Did you come across any SOE women who did that?
So, not yet. I mean, I won't be surprised, I think. But on the other hand, I think it's more likely that you find those where it wasn't the whole mission type moments, right? Where they kind of flirt their way out of a check stop or something like that. I don't have any cases yet of women who, you know, seduced a German officer or anything like that. Not in the SOE, but there certainly were cases of that in the French resistance. And so it's interesting because like they're really integrated, at least in the French case, with, you know, in some cases you had women who started in the French resistance and then had to escape for whatever reason and went to London and then were sent back by the SOE. And I mean, they really, especially by the time you get to D-Day, it's like 2 or 3 British people and like a lot of French people, right? So I haven't seen that for the SOE, but I'm sure that it probably was going on some level. Yeah.
You got to admit, I can't think of a better spy than a pregnant woman.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, like you said, they didn't suspect women much to begin with, but a pregnant woman, the Germans would never suspect a pregnant woman.
Yeah, and I don't know enough about her though, except for the fact that there seems to be a period where she actually was arrested while she was pregnant, and it does seem to be the pregnancy that got her out of it, because they were like, well, no way, you know, and that's when she went home to mom. Like she got out of, the SOE just thought she'd like run to ground and didn't know what was going on, and then Claude, I think, maybe knew she was pregnant. It's a very thin file, so I'm trying to figure that out. There was a question here.
You mentioned Violette may or may not have been tortured in that.
Yeah.
What was the story behind that?
So why it matters? Yeah, thank you. So in the 60s, I think I kind of gestured to this a little bit. There was big blowback against the SOE. A lot of, basically criticism of its suggestions that it hadn't been effective, that they had been a bunch of cowboys, that they didn't really know what they were doing, and had sent a bunch of people into Europe basically to be killed, like sheep to the slaughter. Like I said, their casualty rates were really high. And so they asked this guy, M.R.D. Foote, who was like an Oxford academic but had also served somehow, to write the first history of the SOE in France. And one of the things that he wrote was that the women agents hadn't been tortured, hadn't really done all that much. He was very kind of dismissive of their service. And up until that point, there had been a lot of attention paid to this idea that Violette had for sure been tortured, and he was like, no, she wasn't, and she may not have been. Doesn't mean that a lot didn't, actually go down. And so people like Odette kind of freaked out and came out publicly and so forth. And so that kind of created this mythology around the SOE that they sort of sucked and were not really all that fantastic. And a lot of it was very gendered and kind of tied to this denigration of women. At the same time, something that's really fascinating to me is that there was a push by other people to properly honor their service by finally bestowing some actual military honors on these women. And this is a story that I'm really interested in, where there was a female parliamentarian who decided they wanted to give the Victoria Cross, top British military honor, to a woman. And they were like, who should we give it to? And it became down again, as always, sort of between Violette and Odette. And there was a push for Odette because she was still alive and they could make a big thing of it, although, Tanya was still alive and they would always bring her out as well in these sorts of situations. But basically, Dame Irene Ward, the parliamentarian, if you look at the records behind the scenes, she's basically like, do you know what that woman got up to in France? Like, about the Churchill affair. Yeah, we're not giving her the Victoria Cross. And so it's so fascinating to me, because like I said, they always glossed it over in public because they really wanted this romance. But there was some frowning about it behind the scenes, yes, more puritanical views of their relationship.
Anybody get the Victoria Cross?
Not at that point. Yeah, it kind of all seems to. I need to finish reading through those files. It seems to kind of have floated away a little bit, but yeah.
Very few Victoria Crosses. Isn't it like 85 in
Yeah,
the
there's not
entire
very
history
many.
of Britain have been awarded?
So yeah, I should find that out actually when the first one actually did go down. I got all caught up in the calling her a slut in the documents. I need to go back and actually see the end of that story. But yeah. We're almost out of time, so yes, thank you very much.